Ian McGilchrist, in his book The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, argues that societies have inhabited the world with different mental biases at different times, and that these biases are intimately linked with the different ways our left and right hemispheres of the brain experience the world and respond to it. He further argues that in this modern age, we have neglected the right hemisphere, which sees and understands the most, in favour of the left hemisphere that has a rather narrowing view of the world. When we consider the lived experience of schizophrenics and autistics, we see a hemispheric bias towards the left side of the brain. By getting into the heads of those who experience the world in this way, we might be able to notice similar tendencies in the culture at large, and therefore be informed as to possible imbalances of our attention and perceptions. For what we attend to becomes our world, our reality. And if we're not attending to the things we should, then we had better get informed of such deficits, lest our world becomes increasingly lopsided. McGilchrist offers that, quote, diseases of the brain and mind, though disruptive and distressing for the individuals who have to suffer them, offer us rare insights into human experience as a whole, for which we should be grateful. They throw into relief our normal reality by showing us how it could be altered and appear quite differently to us. Unquote. Schizophrenia and autism have many similar features that are characteristic of right hemisphere deficits. So these conditions prove enlightening when exploring the world from the perspective of a dominant left hemisphere. That is not to say there are no deficits in the left hemisphere, as there are disturbances of language in both conditions, but it is in the perception of reality from the left hemisphere that seems prominent in both schizophrenia and autism. There are three important functions dependent on the right hemisphere: sustained attention, reading faces, and empathy. These are impaired in schizophrenia and autism, but also it seems to be increasingly impaired in the modern world. Is it possible that we are living in a world that is increasingly reliant on the left hemisphere, catering to the left hemisphere, and developing in a continual feedback loop that takes us further into the world of the left hemisphere? The distinguished professor of psychology, Louis Sass, certainly thinks the core of modernism closely resembles the experience of schizophrenics in his books Madness and Modernism, Insanity in the Light of Modern Art, Literature and Thought. He says, European culture, over the last 3 centuries or so, has been increasingly dominated by individualism and subjectivism, by rationalism and relativism. If schizoid and schizophrenic people, like other human beings, are subject to the influences of their social milieu, it is not hard to see how a number of their core traits, the asocial turning inwards, lack of spontaneity, detachment from emotion, the hyper-abstractedness, anxious deliberation and cognitive slippage, and exquisitely vulnerable sense of self-esteem, might be exaggeration of tendencies fostered by this civilization. So what is the phenomenology of the right hemisphere and that of schizophrenia? McGilchrist explains. We have seen that every kind of visual distortion and hallucination found in schizophrenia is also found in right hemisphere dysfunction, along with auditory, tactile and olfactory hallucinations. As far as delusions go, not merely paranoia, but monothematic delusions such as Capgras and Cotard syndromes are found not just in right hemisphere diseases, but in schizophrenia. Schizophrenic patients are sometimes hard to tell from right brain damaged subjects. When it comes to affect, there tends to be an emotional indifference and passivity in both schizophrenics and right hemisphere deficits. This is manifest in a multitude of deficits involving the ability to feel and express emotions, as well as to perceive and understand the emotional signals of others. Similar observations can be made when it comes to autism. In fact, there are many aspects of the implicit, those things that are not literal, such as irony, sarcasm, and humour, that are lost to the schizophrenic and the left hemisphere, with the propensity to miss the larger context of a social interaction, a story, a conversation. There is an over-reliance on the explicit and literal, which can be rather barren of the richness and subtleties in our normal experience of the world. Theory of mind, the capacity to understand another's point of view, is also problematic for the left hemisphere, the schizophrenic and the autistic, as they always come back to a self-referential perspective from what they already know and find it difficult to imagine being in another person's shoes. Schizophrenics also have difficulty in seeing the whole. There is a breakdown in the capacity for Gestalt perception, as is the case with the left hemisphere. McGilchrist speaks again. Schizophrenic subjects have a reduced capacity to see the whole pattern. They respond faster to local targets and tend to adopt a piecemeal approach in the description of complex images. The problem with not seeing the whole is that you miss the context and see a collection of things that may not hold a lot of meaning as individual decontextualized things. Meaning is often about contextual relationships between things. There is also a sense, with right hemisphere damage and schizophrenia, that situations are not real. People are play acting, as well as a lack of common sense. McGilchrist says, there is a loss of the stabilising, coherence-giving, framework-building role that the right hemisphere fulfills in normal individuals. Both exhibit a reduction in pre-attentive processing and an increase in narrowly focused attention, which is particularistic, over-intellectualising, and inappropriately deliberate in approach. Both rely on piecemeal, decontextualized analysis rather than on an intuitive, spontaneous or global mode of apprehension. Both tend to schematize, for example, to scrutinize the behavior of others, rather as a visitor from another culture might, to discover the rules which explain their behavior. The living becomes machine-like, as if to confirm the primacy of the left hemisphere's view of the world. On schizophrenic patients described by Sass, reporting that the world consists of tools and everything that we glance at has some utilisation. Are we experiencing a world in which there is a growing emotional difference, an over-reliance on the explicit, the literal, over the implicit, and missing the bigger social context? Are we becoming ever more self-referring, inward-looking, and myopic in our perceptions? Where is the intuitive over the analytical, or the awe over the transcendent, over the concrete? Are we more interested in the utility of the world around us rather than its innate beauty for beauty's sake? Are we living in an increasingly left hemisphere world?